Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Walsh, and I'm the advisor of the HBCU-Africa Correspondents Corps. The HBCU-ACC is an initiative of the Center for African Studies at Howard University. Today, one of our correspondents, Jah'I Selassie of Morgan State University, will be having a conversation with Accountability Labs about their work with the democracy cohorts and the working groups on the sidelines of the Democracy Summit. Jah'I, you have the floor.
Thank you for introducing me, Mr. Walsh. Today I am here in conversation with Mr. Alawi Masud of the Summit's Accountability Lab and Mr. McDonald Lewanika, the Accountability Lab's Zimbabwe Chief of Party. We're here today to talk about the upcoming Summit for Democracy, which will be held March 29th to March 30th, 2023 in Washington, D.C. This conversation will serve as an overview of the goals and the Summit's civil society efforts and the overarching goal of inclusivity for African and African-American leaders and citizens. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Masud and Mr. Lewanika. I'd like to move straight into my first question. Could you, Alawi, tell me a little bit more about the work that you do as it pertains to the activities of civil society for the Summit of Democracy?
Yeah, so I help run the summitfordemocracy.org website and newsletter, which is a clearinghouse for all civil society proceedings as it relates to Summit for Democracy. So for example, say a civil society is holding an event and they want to get the word out. They can come to our website, they can post it on there. Say a group in civil society is hosting a report, is developing a report, or is looking for people to get involved in a certain action. They can come to our website and post it on there as well. And in that regard, there's a lot of things coming in with Summit Democracy. So we also host a weekly newsletter on Fridays. So it's also coming out today about what is happening in this space and what is happening in this sphere. So my role is I coordinate that. I communicate with stakeholders on what's coming out, what's coming in, and then also help set up the newsletter itself and help set up the website itself.
Great. And so what are some of the activities that are included for the attendees of the summit?
Sure. So the Summit of Democracy has a unique layout where it was Summit of Democracy 2021, a year of action, and then Summit of Democracy 2023. And so Summit of Democracy 2021 was kind of the start of all this, where countries came in with their commitments on what they commit to do coming into the 2023 summit. And then the year of action in the middle was civil society, private entrepreneurship, other institutions working on those commitments. So, and that being said, during this year of action, in between, all sorts of actions were happening. For example, there are cohorts that are focused on particular area groups, such as the rule of law cohort. I believe you guys did an interview with them the other day. They had the anti-corruption cohorts. There's actually 2, 3-ish that were working heavily on these commitments themselves and on other recommendations. So Summit for Democracy 2023 itself, what is going to happen at the end of this month is going to talk about what were the progress on these commitments, what do we do next, and how do we continue working on this sort of action. Does that answer the question?
Yes, definitely. And how are the decisions made to determine what events involving civil society will be held during the summit and which will not?
That's not on my end per se. It's actually hosted by each government. So for Summit of Democracy 2023, there are 5 different governments that are hosting a particular work stream all around the world. So the US is hosting one, Netherlands is hosting another, Korea is hosting another, Costa Rica is hosting another, and Zambia is hosting another. I believe that's all of them. McDonald or anybody else, correct me if I'm wrong. And each of these governments decide what's going to be on their agenda. So for example, Costa Rica has a strong focus and is focusing on youth rights. So their part of the summit during the summit days, which is at the end of the month, is going to be specifically on youth rights, and they make the agenda, and they're the ones who are actually hosting the event itself. However, civil society has come through with different ways to get involved. So a great example of this is International IDEA, and other partners are hosting the Partners Day event on the 27th, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on that as well. And the Partners Day event is basically a day right before the Summer of Democracy for any civil society to get involved and to host events on. So if you'd like more information on that, just let me know.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to just ask, it seems like the advancement for inclusivity for all marginalized groups is an important goal for the summit. What does this mean for members of the African American community and as it pertains to that particular community?
That's a really, really good question. On inclusion itself, with civil society, I think that civil society has to continuously make an effort on inclusion. So regardless of what happens, they have to understand that youth, gender, other marginalized communities have to be involved in any sort of process whatsoever. There are cohorts that are made on this particular idea, which is, I believe there's a cohort on youth, there's a cohort on inclusion. And just a quick recap, what a cohort is USG, the US government helps set up official working groups for the Summer of Democracy to work on each particular item. For example, again, youth, inclusion and democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So for members of the African American community, I believe that they can get involved in these cohorts in producing sort of those outcomes, and also be involved in the Summer of Democracy proceeding themselves, and also host events as well.
Yes, great. And McDonald, I had a few questions for you. I wanted to ask, to what extent are African countries involved in the events of the summit? And are there any events that are specifically targeted toward their current political issues?
Yeah, thanks. So I think as Alawi explained, there are a number of African countries that participated in the Summit for Democracy the first time around in 2021. These countries are also involved in the Summit for Democracy this time around, with some additions. So initially in 2021, there were 16 countries participating. This time around, those countries have increased to about 21, sorry. In addition to participation by African countries in the Summit for Democracy process, you also have the participation of civil society. And both the civil society participation and also the country level participation is part of the process of ensuring that the conversations that are taking place at the summit also feature conversations that are important to African people and to African countries. I think it's an open secret that on our continent, democracy is in decline. There is creeping authoritarianism all over. So it is a pertinent question for us to look at. And for the Africa side of things, I think as Alawi mentioned, different countries are focusing on different topical issues. The issues that we're going to be discussing in Zambia are actually related to elections. And elections have been quite problematic on the continent in terms of their freeness and fairness, in terms of their integrity. All of these are issues that are front and center to our concerns and interests as African people. So yeah, there is space within the conversations in the Summit for Democracy for conversations on issues that are important to us as African people.
Yes. And so there were some concerns raised how the Summit for Democracy was politicized back in 2021. And at the time the summit was first launched, it did not seem that cooperation between democracies would be so problematic. So in your opinion, McDonald, is it more or less difficult for democracies to collaborate on the summit commitments this time around? How has that kind of impacted the work of the cohorts?
Yeah, okay, so in terms of collaboration this time around, I think in order for the agenda to be bought, in order for the processes to be easy, and in order for coordination to take place, ownership of the process is an important element. The first time around, it was the Biden-Harris administration hosting this conversation, calling everyone else from different parts of the world to say, come and let us have a conversation around democracy, how to improve it at home, and how to promote it abroad. This time around, part of what is interesting, as Alawi mentioned, is the decentralized nature and the presence of multiple conveners of the conversation. So the fact that the Zambian government is co-hosting the Summit for Democracy with the US or the government of Costa Rica, the government of South Korea, the Netherlands, and those ones. The fact that convenership is now being owned also promotes the extent to which the summit itself ceases to be a conversation that is being sponsored by America to the rest of the world and becomes a collective conversation in which different countries and different regions in the world are able to participate on account of ownership and control of the process and of the agenda. So I think that this time around that has helped the process. The second thing that I think is improved with regards to the Summit for Democracy this time around is the fact that even though there was quite a lot of non-state actor participation in the first Summit for Democracy, it was fairly muted and very difficult and quite bureaucratic for civil society and private sector actors to participate. This time around, I think that the process has been much more open. I know that in Costa Rica, the government there is actually collaborating with civil society through the European Partnership for Democracy's Youth Democracy Cohort to actually co-convene that particular process. And that in itself is quite remarkable. The government of Zambia and the US government here has opened up the process in a meaningful and interesting way for voices other than those of states to be at the table and be part of the conversation where the Summit for Democracy is concerned, including through pre-summit activities that allow us to speak amongst ourselves and agree what kind of input we are actually taking to the Summit for Democracy. I hope that that answers at least part of the question that you posed, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And back to you, Alawi, I just wanted to ask, how can, kind of following up on the previous question I had for you, how can HBCUs be included in this conversation for inclusivity as you all strive to also work with marginalized groups to make sure that they are heard and seen?
Yeah, and first I want to reiterate the fact that HBCU involvement and involvement from African-American community is very, very important, and it has to happen. And this is an onus not only on civil society, but everyone involved with this process. That being said, the way that HBCUs can be involved is communicating with the cohorts and reaching out to them. We have our contact information for every cohort on our website. So that's one important way. Second way is being involved with the events that are happening. I believe, for example, the Humanitarian Securities Working Group is having multiple events this month itself. So being involved in those in those events as well. And thirdly, just checking up on what's going on with each of these events, which each of these processings. If you look at our newsletter, we have an update every single week on what's going on. So just reaching out to people and asking, hey, we'd like to get involved. And the onus is also on them to facilitate that as well.
And have there been any sort of outreach efforts to involve younger groups, like those of different generations, like Generation Z, millennials? Has there been any efforts towards that?
Yeah, so the main outreach effort on different generations is going to be towards your youth cohort. They've been very heavily actively working, and they recently launched a very interesting initiative where it's called Action and Advocacy Grants, I believe. With that, they made a menu of commitments for youth, right? Meaning that governments need to subscribe to these commitments in order to further youth in their democracy, in order to empower youth in their democracy. And they were thinking like, okay, we made these many of commitments. How do we actually push that forward? So they've actually developed a grant program to help organizations who also subscribe to these ideals and this idea to help push these commitments towards governments, to help advocate for these commitments towards governments. So on the different generation things, you're going to have the youth cohort. We're doing amazing work in that regard.
And where can our listeners find out more about the Summit for Democracy?
Sure. Yeah. So there's multiple areas. The first is going to be the official State Department website that they have. The second is our website, which is summitfordemocracy.org, but it's a 4 instead of a 4. The third place is International IDEA also hosts a summary of all what's going on with each of the cohorts. So those are the 3 places on the top of my mind, but each cohort also have dedicated portals towards each of their ideas. I mean, towards each of what they're doing. So if you want to take a look at our website to find those portals, just take a look. Thanks.
So McDonald, what are some of the ways that our listeners can get involved? What events that can they attend for the summit?
Yeah, so as Alawi mentioned, there's a very large menu of activities and events that are going to be taking place during the Summit for Democracy itself and prior to the Summit for Democracy and immediately after. For people who are interested in the conversation on elections and democracy in Africa, there is a pre-summit event, the Civil Society Summit in defense of democracy to be taking place on the 27th and 28th. It will be live streamed. Information around the stream, you can be able to get it off the www.summitfordemocracy website during the course of the next couple of days. And as I mentioned, there's a big conversation on inclusion that will be taking place on the 31st of March. Again, it will be live streamed, but it will be taking place in Lusaka, being hosted by the Carter Center as part of the Partners for Democracy Days associated with the summit itself.
McDonald, so what happens after the summit? What is kind of the aftermath? Where do the cohorts go from here after the summit is completed? What happens with them? What happens with the knowledge that they've gained?
Thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so for a lot of organizations participating in the cohorts and participating in the summit, the idea is to use this second Summit for Democracy as a catalytic moment where we continue to strengthen and build ties across cohorts and across organizations around several democracy questions that are at stake where the summit is concerned. So for a lot of cohorts, there will be continued collaboration and action on the issues of interest, and because of the devolved nature of the conversation now, I believe that the cohorts themselves are actually going to be democratized as well. At the first summit, a lot of organizations participating in the cohorts were international organizations. The devolution of the process allows local organizations and regional organizations to also begin participating in that conversation. So there is definitely growth and expansion of the conversation and the cohorts that will take place, in addition to thinking around how to localize the conversations more and possibly do regional conversations on democracy that are built off hopefully the success of the second Summit for Democracy in its current form.
Thank you so much, McDonald and Alawi. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
For sure. Thank you for having us on.
Of course.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your time.